Good evening. Today we are going to be finishing our this week, and this is the last class of this week. We are starting off with the chapter of project scope management, which is fifth chapter in a guide to project management body of knowledge. And this chapter is very instrumental in the sense that it establishes the product and project scope. Although I have been explaining the whole process earlier, so you would understand what happens in this knowledge area. Especially in planning, we establish the scope. Although, as it was said already, that scope is included in a number of documents. When we are doing feasibility of the project, there is a scope mentioned there. When we are having a contract and a statement of work, there is some kind of scope mentioned there as well. So every successive document elaborates scope even further. So we have to establish when the whole scope of the project is completely established. So it is only after the project manager takes on the project. Okay. Mohsin, can you hear me all right? Okay. Rijo, you can't hear me, huh? Is it breaking up? Okay, today I think the problem is not from my side because my net is working very fine today. So it must be at your end, and what I can do is, can you shift to your mobile? Because if at all you can shift to your mobile network, then you will be able to hear me better. Okay, right. So in scope management, we have number of processes, and you have to be, coming along with me because it is really important that we establish the proper scope. Okay, what did we study? In planning, when we start planning any of the knowledge areas, what is the very first step? The very first step in planning of any knowledge area would be to develop a management plan for that knowledge area. And the very first process in planning is responsible for that purpose. So the first process here is plan scope management, and you can clearly say that this will be responsible for developing the scope management plan. And scope management plan, okay, Rijo, okay, you have reconnected and still you are having problem. Uh, okay, so what should we do? Rijo, it must be problem at your end, and I can't really say anything about it. Uh, have you tried your mobile network? Okay, right. Right, Riju. Is it okay now? Can you hear me loud and clear? Wonderful. Can you speak up? Maybe, I can hear you as well and I would know. Okay, fine. Then I'll move ahead. Right, I was talking about the very first process in planning as far as the scope management knowledge area is concerned. And I said the very first process always would be to develop the management plan. So here our subject, our knowledge area is scope. Therefore, the process here would be plan, scope, management, and the output should be the scope management plan. But if you remember, when we were listing all the management plans, we said that in scope we do not have only the scope management plan, but there is yet another management plan which is prepared here along with the scope management plan, and that is the requirements management plan. So both of these plans, scope management plan and requirements management plan, are to be developed in this very first process. 5.1 Plan Scope Management is responsible for development of two management plans, Scope Management Plan and Requirements Management Plan. Scope Management Plan will be responsible for the management of the overall scope of the whole project, and Requirements Management Plan would be a subordinate management plan to the scope, but it is necessarily required because the requirements are highly dynamic. So how to manage the requirements, how to configure the requirements, how to amend the requirements, all these details are given in the requirements management plan. And requirements management plan will only be required when we are collecting the requirements. 5.2, the next process is collect requirements. So when we are collecting the requirements, we will be using this requirements management plan along with the scope management plan as input. And as a result, we will come out with the requirements themselves. Once we have the requirements completely clarified as far as we can clarify them, and we have all the requirements as we think we could get, then the next step is to define the scope. In defining the scope, it is the most elaborate process in which we are finally putting it all together. Our scope is divided into two parts. One is the product scope and other is the project scope. So based on the requirements we have collected and the requirements we received in with our charter and our contract or the agreement, putting them all together, we come up with the final shape of requirements and put them in the product scope. Once the product scope is clearly defined, only then we will try to establish the project scope, and project scope would include all the activities or processes we need to do to develop that product which has just been defined in product scope. So after,
Sir.
yes,
Sorry to interrupt.
yeah, of course.
Sir, why the requirement management plan is not mentioned here?
It is
Even in the
I am not actually showing you all the details. I am just showing the names of the processes. So requirement management inclusive in 5.1. I'll show you a bit later.
Okay, because even on the chart we had, it wasn't even mentioned on that as well.
Which chart? Okay.
Sir, the 3.1.
That chart only enlisted on all the processes, and this list is also of only the processes. Requirement management plan is not a process. Requirement management plan is a document. Similarly, scope management plan is also a document. It is also not mentioned here. Scope management plan is not mentioned here. Here the name of the process is shown as plan scope management. This is the process name, not the document name. As a result of this process, we will get two things. One is the scope management plan, other is the requirements management plan. Do you understand my point?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. So we will talk about how the requirement management plan is developed. Anyways, in defined scope, we have established the product scope based on the requirements we have so far gathered. Naturally, the requirements we get from the stakeholders, they all do not have to be complied with. Some of the requirements could be ridiculous. They could be completely out of scope. So we don't say no to it. We listen to them. We convince them. We try to understand how these requirements can fit into the project scope, and if they can't, then we tell them, we convince them, we present to them that this requirement cannot be fulfilled within the scope of the project. And if they are convinced, that is fine. If they are not convinced, then we will escalate the issue to the next higher level. That is very important thing. As a project manager, you have no authority to simply say no to any requirement. Or for that matter, later on, when there are changes and there is a change request coming from the stakeholder, again, you have no authority to say no. You have to analyze that. You have to convince, present to the stakeholder, and if they agree, it is okay. If they don't agree, then you have to escalate it. Anyways, that is another story. Well, I was talking about the defined scope. Here we establish the product scope and the project scope. Once the product scope is established, project scope can be established, all the work which has to be done. Naturally, we just want to create an image of how the project will be done. So project scope will have to include all the possible solutions to create that product. There could be many alternatives in front of you, many alternative methods to produce the product. You will analyze each one of them and recommend the best option. Once you have come up with this recommendation and it is agreed upon, then the next step is that you break this approach, this work approach, into smaller portions which you want to call as phases, which would be sequential in nature. So the project life cycle is defined also in the scope, defined scope. And as a result of all this, you will come up with a final document which is called project scope statement. So the output of defined scope is project scope statement. Once we have this document, we move on to the next and last planning process, because after create WBS, we have nothing to do in planning. The rest of the two processes, validate scope and control scope, they exist in monitoring and controlling of the process of the project. Therefore, create WBS is the last planning process. So here we further break down our scope into work packages. We break our scope to that level that we need to exercise our control at. So those work packages are to be identified, broken down to the work package. Work packages are identified and described. So there are two outputs coming out of it. One is the work breakdown structure itself, and the other is a dictionary of this work breakdown structure, which means a list of all the work packages identified with a brief description of each work package. That is called a WBS dictionary. Anyways, because this is the last process of planning, and when scope, time or cost, they have been planned, they are in the last process, they are to be baselined. This is scope, therefore we need to baseline it. So once we baseline the scope, baseline of the scope will include three items, and these three items are the outputs of the previous process and this process. Previous process we got the scope statement, and here we got the WBS and WBS dictionary. These three items put together are called the scope baseline. Then this baseline and the management plans form part of the project management plan. Project management plan, you know, as per integration, they will be executed from the integration, by the integration in the process direct and manage project work. Therefore, scope does not have any process in execution of its own. But in monitoring and control, we need to have a complete control from all the knowledge areas except HR. So here we have two processes from scope. One is called the validate scope and other is called the control scope. You understand that controls normally deal with the post review of the work which has occurred or happened in the execution, and validation of the scope is something to do with the product. So from execution, when the deliverable had been produced, it was sent to monitoring and control. First it was checked by quality control, which verified the deliverable, and the deliverable was then called the verified deliverable. This verified deliverable comes to validate scope for final user acceptance, and if it is accepted from here, it is called accepted deliverable or validated deliverable. This is the job of validate scope, to accept a deliverable, to conduct the user acceptance testing. So anything which clears validate scope is an accepted deliverable, and it is ready to be handed over to the customer through our closing process group. As far as control scope is concerned, you remember from execution, as far as the processes were being done, all the news and data about the processes, how they are being done, is being sent to execution as work performance data. This work performance data, I told you earlier, goes to 8 different controls, and scope is one of those 8 different controls. Every control was responsible for comparing this work performance data with the relevant management plan, and in this case this is the scope management plan, and it is dealing with work. So it will compare it with what? It will compare it with the work. Work performance data is compared with the plan, that is the project scope, and it is seen which jobs have not been done and which have been done, how much scope has been completed and which has not been completed. That difference is called the variation, and based on this variation we establish the trend, we project the future progress, and ultimately we forecast what will be the future of this project. Ultimately when the project will end, what will be the status of the scope. So all this is to be done through control scope. Whereas validate scope was comparing the deliverable with what? It was comparing it with the product scope. So you remember the two scopes we established, product scope and project scope. Validate scope deals with comparing the deliverable with the product scope. That was the requirements. And control scope deals with the comparison of work performance data with the project scope. I hope I am clear about it. Is it so?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So this was the brief description of all the 6 processes, 4 in planning and 2 in monitoring and control. This is all about scope. So let's look at it in a little bit more detail. Scope management plan, the project scope management includes the processes required to ensure that the project includes all the work required and only the work required. This is a very important sentence. Project should include all the work which is required to be done to produce the desired product. Meaning none of the work which had to be done can be skipped. All the work which is required to be done to produce that product, all that work must be done. And only that work should be done. No extra work, redundant work should be included in the project, because that would be overload on the project from the financial and duration point of view. We don't want to do extra work. We only want to work economically. efficiently only that much work which is required to be done, and all that work which is required to be done. And this is to complete the project successfully. So what if I tell you that project deliverable is accepted, but all the work of the project was not done? What is your conclusion? What kind of a project is this? Without completing all the work required, your product has been produced. What kind of situation is this? Yes, please. Weird situation. Yes, of course. It is a weird situation. It is not a possibility. That essentially means, Rijo says, not in line with project scope baseline. Exactly, very right. Because project scope line included the scope statement, which included the product scope and the project scope. You completed the product scope, but project scope is not completed. It makes the whole process doubtful. How can it be possible that all the work which had to be done to produce the product has not been done and still the product has been produced? That means you have not planned well. You have put in those activities which were not required to be done. And without doing those activities, the deliverable was delivered. And still there are a lot many things which are still to be done. That is one conclusion. The other conclusion is, if the whole work was necessary and it was supposed to be done and it was not done, then there must be something wrong with the acceptance, user acceptance. You must have accepted the deliverable which is not to be accepted. Either the deliverable is faulty and you have accepted it wrongly, or you must have planned extra work which was not supposed to be in the scope of the work. So as I said, only the work required. So only the work required had to be done, no extra work. So you see what kind of a test this is. This is a very, elaborate testing in which you can find by checking the product scope and the project scope whether everything is going right or not. Managing the project scope is primarily concerned with defining and controlling what is and is not included in the project. You have to be very firm about this. You have to be sure about it. What is to be included, what is to be done, and what is not to be done. So you will not accommodate anything which is not contributing towards the product, towards the scope of the project. Therefore, no extra work will be done and your project will be economical as well as efficient. Now, a brief description of each one of these processes. I have already defined them in front of you. The scope management process, this process, the process of creating a scope management plan primarily is the scope management plan. It did not mention the requirement management plan, but once we will describe the scope management plan in further detail, you will see the requirement management plan is also developed here. But because requirement management plan is kind of a subordinate plan to scope management plan, so it is not really mentioned here. So scope management plan documents how the project scope will be defined, validated and controlled. And naturally, when we talk about defining the scope, to some extent requirements are also covered in it. So that is exactly why the scope management plan is a bigger plan. Collect requirements is the process of determining, documenting and managing stakeholder needs and requirements to meet the project objective. And to do this, we need to have the requirement management plan. Although we need to have the scope management plan also for this purpose, but for further details, for minute details of collecting the requirement and maintaining the requirement, we need to have the requirement management plan. Again, that will be shown when the requirement, this process is further elaborated. Define scope is a process of doing what? this is where the scope management, scope statement is developed, where the product and project scope is established. So the process of developing a detailed description of the project and product. Then is the create WBS process, the process of subdividing the project deliverables and project work into smaller, more manageable components. And at this point, we baseline the scope. And what does the baseline include? The scope baseline includes the scope statement, the WBS, and the WBS dictionary. Then in monitoring and control, we have validate scope. This is the process of formalizing the acceptance. This is user acceptance testing of the completed project deliverable. This relates with the deliverable only, not the work of the project. So if it is dealing with a deliverable, that must be dealing with a product scope. Control scope is a process of monitoring the status of project and product scope and managing changes to the scope baseline. This deals with the work of the project. This deals with the project scope. So these were the 6 processes. This is the exact difference between the product scope and the project scope. What is the product scope? All the functions and features that are to be included in the product or service. You mean the requirements, the specifications, the dimensions, each and every requirement is included in the product scope. That product scope just defines what the deliverable would look like, what will be its dimensions, what will be its various requirements and features and functions. All this is included in the product. But this does not talk about how this product is to be produced. This is not the subject of product scope. Product scope only deals with what is to be produced. Project scope deals with how it is to be produced. This is the work that must be done in order to deliver a product with the specified features and functions as per the product scope. So all the work involved to create the deliverable according to the product scope is called project scope. Similarly, how do you measure? Successful completion is, for product scope, is measured against the requirements. Product scope is measured against the requirements. And where do we do that? We do that in validate scope. Validate scope process does this job. It checks the product scope. It measures the requirements. How much requirements have been fulfilled and how much have not been fulfilled. If they have not been fulfilled, the product is not cleared. This is not validated. It is the user acceptance testing. And how do we measure the project scope? Project scope is measured against the plan. That means the project scope, we already have a plan in which all the activities or work which had to be done to achieve the product scope was listed. All that work has to be done and this is to be checked in project scope, and the name of the process where it is checked is control scope. So this defines very clearly that product scope and project scope, though a major part of the scope statement, but they actually both are checked respectively in the validate scope process and the control scope process in monitoring and control naturally. Scope statement. Now,
excuse me, sir.
yes, please.
Sir, WBS is the place where we define phases?
No, we define phases in scope statement, but we further break it down to the work package level in WBS. You understand that? I say I have to construct this house,
Yeah.
and this house will be done in 3 phases. First phase is all the work which is done underground. Then I'll do the superstructure, that is the second phase, and third is the finishing of the building. all the electrical circuits and everything, and finishing till finishing. So if these are my three phases, then each phase has to be further broken down to a comfortable level where I can monitor and control my project. So from project manager's point of view, maybe the construction of wall is a work package. Flooring is a work package. Maybe, casting of the slab is a work package. We do understand that each one of these work packages can further be divided into activities, but those minor activities project manager may not be interested in monitoring directly. His supervision team can take care of that. So the level he wants to monitor himself, how much wall has been constructed, how much the flooring has been done, how much the roof slab has been done. So he would rather be interested in the work packages. Therefore, we want to break the work breakdown structure down to a level which is comfortable for the project manager to monitor. So that is called the work package. But later on, when we go into the time management knowledge area, we will further break down these work packages into activities, because for estimation purposes, we will need activities as if we can do the bottom-up estimation. We'll talk about that later, but here in scope statement, we only break it down to the phase level. In WBS, we break them down to the work package level. And in define activities, we break the work packages down to the activity level. So there are three different places where the breakup happens. The major breakup happens, the top level breakup happens in the scope statement. The middle level breakup happens in the WBS, and activity level breakup happens in the define activity process of time management. Is it fine?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. So what is this scope statement? Basically, when the charter was given to you from the project sponsor, he naturally wrote something down for you. And although the document itself was not very elaborative, it was a very short order, but that did include a justification for the project from the point of view of the project sponsor. As per the business case and other documents, he has provided a very brief purpose of the project, a justification why are we doing this project, based on what decision we are doing this project. And he also defined what is to be produced, how is it to be produced briefly, maybe if there some approach is there, and if there are any high level risks or constraints or limitations or anything he wanted to provide, he could have provided in the charter. But you see, that was the justification provided by him, and that was a very high level justification. Now, project ball is in the project manager's court. He has to, before he can start doing the job, he has to be sure about that this job which I am undertaking is really doable. So he will carry out his own analysis, and he will dig down the things a little deeper, and he will provide his own justification for the project, whether it can be done or not. This is the time when project manager can say this cannot be done and I am unable to do it. So therefore this should not be done. But if project manager goes through this phase of developing the scope statement, he develops the scope statement, and that scope statement is approved, then project manager has no way to turn back and say it was an undoable project, but I just agreed with you. No, project manager has to provide the justification of his own, whether this project can be done, how it can be done, what will be the major deliverables, what are the project objectives, and generally he will divide it into the project phases and will show confidence in this document how he would like to do it. So this is a commitment from the project manager's point of view. Otherwise, I have also mentioned that the product and project scope is established here. The different approaches to do the project are established here, and the best approach is selected, and then the best approach is further divided into phases. every phase is allocated the responsibility and what are going to be the deliverables of each phase, who will be responsible for doing that, and what will be the criteria of success for each phase. So all this has to be defined in the scope statement. And moreover, it will also include any further detailed assumptions, because the assumptions, limitations, risks, constraints, all which were provided in charter were very high level. Now the project manager is in a capacity and in a position that he can define the things in further detail, in-depth detail. Therefore, his constraints and all those provided would be much more detailed, and they will expand on what was given in charter or contract or any previous document. So I don't say that he will not entertain any constraint which was given to him in charter or the earlier documents. He will entertain those constraints, but at the same time, if some constraint is no more, or some constraint, some new constraints he can come up with, so he will have to provide them as if this document can be approved by the project sponsor, and ultimately he will be allowed, project manager will be allowed to plan further. So this is a very important point. This is a proper justification from the project manager side, and then it is a commitment. Once he justifies something and it is approved, then it is a commitment by the project manager that I will do it and I can do it, and it can be done also. And as I said, the second point is criteria used to determine if the project or phase has been successfully completed. How would we determine that this phase or this project has been completed? Because the criteria for that, what is to be produced, what is to be checked at the end of a project or a phase, which will declare it successful, this is to be established in scope statement. So this all is included in the scope statement. So generally speaking, if you can, you want to have certain, areas what are to be covered in scope statement, then you must have project objectives. Actually, scope statement will have almost the same ingredients which the project charter has, but project charter is very brief document, maybe a 1 page or 1.5 page long, not a very lengthy document. But scope statement is elaborate. Although the headings, the topics covered are maybe the same, almost the same, except for few exceptions, like phases are not there in charter. They can be there if the senior management wants to define how many phases should be there in a project. They can tell you in the scope in the charter. But if they are not given, project manager is supposed to provide those details. Identification of stakeholders and all those things, they might have been provided some input at the charter level. Anyways, you define the project objectives, project justification has to be provided, project deliverables, what will be the project deliverables, what is the scope description, acceptance criteria, any inclusions or exclusions, assumptions or constraints, limitations, risks, all these things have to be defined in scope statement in a little bit more detail than the charter or any previous document. Okay, right. Um, can you see the slide of all the processes? Do let me know if you can see the slide. Just like integration, we have put all the 6 processes of scope on one page. This shows all the 6 processes under scope management, project scope management knowledge area. And here we have plan scope management 5.1 with all its inputs, tools and techniques and outputs. 5.2 is the collect requirements and all that. Mohsen, if you want to see, you can look at 5.2 and 5.1 and see what are the outputs. We have scope management plan and we have requirements management plan. Now let us go to collect requirements and see what are the inputs. Scope management plan and requirements management plan. You see, requirement management plan is only required for this process of collect requirements. No other process will require the requirement management plan. Remaining all the processes are having the scope management plan. You see the defined scope has input scope management plan, create WBS as an input scope management plan, validate scope and control scope doesn't have scope management plan, it has project management plan. Both have project management plan, and you know and understand that scope management plan and all other management plans are inclusive of the project management plan. In addition to that, there are other requirement documentation and requirement traceability, which was the output of the 5.2 collect requirements. You see the two items as an output in collect requirements. These are the inputs in validate scope as well as in control scope. So just to put your query to rest, I just explained this a bit. Otherwise, we are going to discuss each one of these processes in detail. Okay, planned scope management, as we defined earlier, is the process of creating a scope management plan that documents how the project scope will be defined, validated and controlled. So all these processes here in planning are the definition of the scope. And in monitoring and control, we have two jobs. One is the validation and one is the control. And for each of them, we have got one separate process. Key benefit of this process is that it provides the guidance and direction on how the project scope will be managed throughout the project life cycle. This is the scope management plan I am talking about. I have yet not talked about the requirements management plan. It will come a little later. Guidelines for how scope is to be managed and how scope changes are to be integrated into the project. If there is any change in the scope, how the change request can be moved, who can move it, what is the process, and ultimately when the scope changes are approved, how they will form part of the updated project management plan, or the project documents will be updated accordingly. It includes an assessment of the stability of the project scope. So as such, at the point when the scope management plan is being created, we don't know what is the scope. But at least we know what kind of project you are getting into and how stable the scope of this project is likely to be. For example, you are getting into a research project for which you do not know the expected results. You are not clear about what is the deliverable. So the scope of such a project is very highly likely to change a lot. So you can say your assessment could be that the stable of a research project is, the stability of this research project is not very much, is a very low stability. And if you are constructing a house, and what can change in a house? The locations, the dimensions or something like that. But if there are 3 rooms to be constructed, there are 3 rooms to be constructed. Probably there cannot be, complete change of design or complete change of the scope. So therefore, we could say that a construction project like this is a rather more stable project. The scope of such a project is more stable. So this much can be defined at the level of scope management plan. Otherwise, we don't know the details of the scope, which will be elaborated in the subsequent processes. So a clear description of how scope changes will be identified and classified. This is also part of the scope management plan. Scope management plan is naturally, you understand, it is a component of the project management plan, or if there is a program management plan, it is a component of that describes how the scope will be identified, defined, developed, monitored, controlled and verified. I would change the word verified to validated, because in new standard they do not use the word verified for scope. The scope management plan is a major input into the development of the project management plan and scope management processes. The subsequent scope management processes, naturally, scope management plan is going to help us, define the scope, help us create the WBS and all that, and even collect the requirements. Scope management plan can be a formal or informal, broadly framed or highly detailed. Now this is the common statement for all the plans. What we say is that depending on the size and complexity of the project, You may like to have a very detailed formal plan or broadly framed informal plan. Maybe, you say, I just jotted down few points and that is my scope management plan. Even that is okay, right? Or even you can have just you say, I don't write it, it is in my mind. So for a very small little project, you can keep the scope management plan in your mind. But generally speaking, it is a good practice to document it anyways, no matter how big or small that thing is. But generally for complex projects and detailed projects, we have to have a formal document. And that is all based on the needs of the project. The components of the scope management plan include process for preparing a detailed project scope statement. And that is done where? This is done in define scope process, which is the next process after we have collected the requirements. So it is not directly addressing the collection of the requirements, because that would be addressed by the requirements management plan. Although scope management plan is a contributing factor while we are trying to collect the requirements, but the main job of the scope management plan is to develop a detailed project scope statement, which is to be done in the process, namely define project scope. Then the next process that enables the creation of the WBS, that is create WBS process from the detailed project scope statement. The basic thing which prompts the WBS to be created is the project scope statement. Based on the project scope statement, we will further break it down and develop our breakdown structure. Process that establishes how the WBS will be maintained and approved. This is to be established in the scope management plan, because scope management plan defines everything which is to be done in the subsequent processes. So how, when the WBS is created, no matter what WBS is, what would be the procedure of maintaining and improving it, that was to be included in the scope management plan. Process that specifies how formal acceptance of the completed project deliverable will be obtained. The procedure for formal acceptance, the user acceptance mechanism, that is to be defined in the scope management plan. Process to control how requests for changes to be detailed. So how the scope changes are to be processed, who can move them. So this is also defined in scope management plan. And finally, this process is directly linked to the perform integrated change control process. You see, what does the perform integrated change control does? It receives all the change requests and processes them. So scope is directly impacted by that, and it has to define how it will get, all the changes will get to the integrated chain control. Now is the question of requirement management plan. This is what, Mohsin, you must listen carefully. This was your question. The requirement management plan is again a component of the project management plan, and it describes how the requirements will be analyzed, documented and managed. Although this may be treated as a part of scope management plan, but by itself requirement management plan is a complete management plan itself, because the requirements we will gather from the stakeholders will keep coming, will keep changing. Even the stakeholders will keep changing, so the requirements will also keep changing. Somebody has to have an elaborate mechanism to keep a track of all the requirements and keep them updated. So how they will be analyzed, how they will be documented, how they will be managed, this all has to be established in the requirement management plan. The face-to-face relationship strongly influences how requirements are managed. So you have established, how the things will travel from one phase to the other, the face-to-face relationship, what requirements are to be completed in the first phase and what are expected to be done in the next phase. So though we don't know the phases as yet, but generally how this handover will take place. Project manager chooses the most effective relationship for the project and documents this approach in the requirement management plan. You understand that management plans just contain approach. They do not contain the document itself, the procedure itself. That would be designed later. So when we will be collecting the requirements, actual data will actually be populated at that point in time. But how we expect to deal with the data, deal with the requirements, is to be established in the requirement management plan. Many of the requirement management plan components are based on that relationship. So components of the requirement management plan can include how requirements activities will be planned, tracked and reported. Now this is important because you say there is a requirement that this car I am producing must be able to go as fast as 200 miles per hour, right? So this is a requirement which you have to plan for that. Then you have to track this requirement, whether it is able to run at 200 miles per hour, and then it has to be reported. So the mechanism of tracking the requirement is to be given in the requirement management plan, the general mechanism, because that will be when the requirement will be identified, collected and identified, then we will establish, according to this rule, we will establish the exact parameters of that requirement. And the requirements will change. Later on, someone may say, okay, we don't need that fast a car. Let us reduce the speed to 150 mile per hour and increase something else. So this new requirement will now be an update to the previous requirement, and therefore the record of all the previous requirements have to be managed, and this is done through configuration management activities such as how changes to the product will be initiated, how impacts will be analyzed, how will be traced and reported, the authorization level required to approve the change, all this which deals with the change of requirements. Although this will go through the same scope change process as we discussed earlier, but here we are specifically talking about changes in requirements. Then there is a requirement prioritization process. Naturally, we would like to prioritize the requirements in such a way that the most, we can deliver the results earlier, the better. So which are the most important requirements which are to be fulfilled? Those are prioritized and are delivered early, as if the customer can be more satisfied and we can have small successes. Product metrics that will be used and the rationale for using them is to be established here. And the interesting part is our traceability structure to reflect which requirement attributes will be captured on the traceability matrix. So what is a traceability matrix? Traceability matrix is a kind of a connection which establishes which for fulfilling which requirement, what are the activities or work packages designed, and through those work packages or activities is the desired deliverable or the product being delivered or not. Now it also connects who is the stakeholder who gave this requirement. So we have a complete trace of who was the stakeholder, what is the requirement, and how this requirement is to be met, which work packages and which activities, and what was the result till deliverable. The whole chain is a trace. So what if a requirement changes? I planned everything, how this requirement is to be fulfilled, but the requirement changes, the stakeholder changes, due to which the requirement changes, and when the requirement changes from 200 to 150 mile per hour, then probably my work packages and activities will be impacted by that. And therefore I have to do the change request and update these activities and work packages as if the deliverable which is to be produced is according to the new requirement, updated requirement. So this is why and how this traceability structure is established. Now the requirements could be classified into a number of ways. There could be business requirements, there could be stakeholder requirements, which could be functional or non-functional. There could be transition requirements. When this deliverable is being delivered to the operations, how would it be transitioned? Maybe you are delivering some um, equipment which has certain conditions for moving that equipment from point A to point B. So you wanted to install all the system which you have completed in project to be installed in, moved and installed, transitioned into the operations. What are the requirements for that? How to handle it with care? Then there are project requirements. To do this project, what specific requirements we need to meet, and there could be some quality requirements. So there are a number of requirements which we need to meet. We'll talk a bit more about that later, but let's first talk about the plan scope management process. And as we have already discussed a lot about it, there should not be much of doubt. Project management plan was definitely required because it is required everywhere. Project management plan gives me the guidance to develop the scope management plan. Therefore, this is the basic input. Charter, because I have to base everything according to the charter. I am actually developing the management plans here, and ultimately there will be a scope statement created in the next process. So charter is required. I should know what we are doing. And enterprise environmental factors and process assets, they are required here. We use the expert judgment and meetings, which we have elaborated earlier a lot. And there are two management plans coming out of this process: scope management plan and requirements management plan. Understand that requirement management plan, though, is a smaller management plan than a scope management plan, and it can even be subordinated under the scope management plan, but the purpose of requirement management plan is very different. It is for management and configuration of the requirements we would be collecting in the next process, which is called collect requirements. Although scope management plan would generally be referred for collecting the requirements, but the main reference would be the requirement management plan for collecting those requirements. Okay, and this is the other diagrammatic layout of that. Exactly the same inputs. Organization gives you enterprise environmental factors and process assets. Develop project charter process 4.1 gave you the charter which you are using in 5.1 scope management. Then 4.2 develop project management plan gave you the project management plan. These are the four inputs required for this process. And what are the outputs of this process? Here you can clearly see scope management plan and requirement management plan. Scope management plan is required by all subsequent processes in planning related to scope. Collect requirements, define scope, and create scope, WBS, all will require the scope management plan, but requirement management plan is only required by collect requirements. I can say that collect requirements needs both of these management plans to be input into it, but define scope and create WBS just require the scope management plan and not the requirements management plan. These two management plans are not required by any other process in project management. The story ends here, because from there onwards we will produce something else. Some other outputs will come out of it, which would then subsequently be input into the subsequent processes. So this is all about the scope management, plan scope management. The inputs, as you have seen, there are the four inputs. Then we have got two tools and techniques. We have already discussed expert judgment and meeting quite in detail, but if you want to read the brief descriptions, they are written here and in the book also. And outputs, as we have already discussed, and I've shown you these slides earlier, what are the contents of that. The scope management plan is defined here and requirement management plan is defined here. And then we move on to the next process, which is collect requirements. Now the collect requirements process is, why are we doing it? We want to determine the requirements of the project. We want to document them, and we also need to manage the stakeholder needs and expectations, because we have to get in touch with the stakeholder and listen to him. What are the needs and expectations? What are the requirements? And how those requirements impact the project objectives. Although I was given some requirements in the contract or agreement or even in the charter, but still those requirements were based on our feasibility, which may have been done much earlier. Is it viable still? This is to be seen. And because all the stakeholders may not have been considered at that stage when the business case was being developed, when the feasibility study was carrying out, when the charter was being developed, now is the time when the project manager has to start the work, and therefore he will have to look at all the stakeholders. We have identified the stakeholders in initiation. Now we are going to interact with those stakeholders and collect their needs and requirements. Key benefit of this process is that it provides the basis for defining and managing the project scope, including the product scope. So we are not only going to be talking about the project scope, but the product scope. We would rather first collect the product scope due to these requirements, and ultimately we will develop the project scope out of the product scope, because project scope is completely dependent on the product scope. What is to be produced, that is the product scope, and how it is to be produced, this is the project scope. So first question is what, and then is the how. First is product scope and then is the project scope. Something about stakeholder involvement here. Why are we involving the stakeholder? Very pet question. People say when you have been given the contract, you have been given the requirement, why do you waste time with the stakeholder? I tried to explain it a bit earlier, and you might have got the picture. But you see, project success is directly influenced by the active stakeholder involvement. That is exactly why we have a separate knowledge area to manage the stakeholders. So active stakeholder involvement is required. If you ignore the stakeholder, you do not involve him, he will be your biggest enemy. He will try his level best to make your project unsuccessful. But if you can take him on board, you can hold his hand, you can keep him updated, you can keep him engaged, and you can give him a feeling that he is being well understood and complied with, then he would be your advocate. He would be the champion of the project. So this involvement in the discovery and decomposition of the needs into requirements, and by the care taken in determining, documenting, and managing the requirements of the product, service, or result of the project. So we are inviting the stakeholders to get involved. And we are saying we are open to suggestions. Come up with your requirements. If they are relevant, we will accommodate them. Requirements include the conditions or capabilities that are to be met by the project or present in the product, service, or result to satisfy an agreement or other formally imposed specifications. Requirements include the quantified and documented needs and expectations of the sponsor, customer, or other stakeholders. So we are not doing project only for the customer. We are not doing project only for our boss. There are a lot many other stakeholders who are involved, and they can play hell with your project. If you don't accommodate all the stakeholders, you have to be very calculative. You have to be very accommodative. You must accommodate all these stakeholders, and all right requirements must be accommodated into the project scope. These requirements need to be elicited, analyzed, and recorded in enough detail to be included in the scope baseline. So when you develop the scope baseline, these requirements must be depicted there and to be measured once the project execution begins. So once the project will start executing, those scope requirements which have been included into the scope baseline will naturally be, project will be monitored according to that. Requirements become the foundation of the WBS. Cost, schedule, quality planning, and sometimes procurement are all based upon these requirements. All other management knowledge areas will be dependent on the scope. You can, once you have established the scope, you can start doing everything else. You can start working on the procurement, you can start working on the scheduling, costing, everything you can start doing only after the scope has been established, because until and unless a proper scope is established, how can you do anything else in the project? The development of requirements begin with an analysis of the information contained in the project charter. Naturally, you analyze the charter. You don't just blindly comply with the charter. Charter may have certain things which are not according to the stakeholder requirements, and therefore we may have to highlight those issues. and get them accommodated. So we look at the project charter, we look at the stakeholder register and the stakeholder management plan. Only then we will be able to properly induct or involve the stakeholder into the project and their needs and requirements into the requirements. As we have seen the business, the different categories of the requirements, the business requirements describes the higher level needs of the organization as a whole, such as the business issues or opportunities and reasons why a project has been undertaken. So those are the business requirements. So there are not only the business requirements, there are the stakeholder requirements also. You can't say that this project is good for my business and that is exactly the only reason why I'm doing this project. This must be, satisfying many stakeholder requirements also. Those stakeholder requirements, which could be formal or informal, which describe needs and expectations of the stakeholders or the groups of stakeholders. And then there could be solution requirements, which describe exact features, functions, characteristics, specifications of the product, service, or result. Again, solution requirements are further grouped into functional and non-functional requirements. Functional requirements are those that describe the behavior of the product, how the product will function. Like this car will uh, you know run at a speed of 200 mile per hour. This is a function. Non-functional requirements supplement functional requirements and describe the environmental conditions or qualities required for the product to be effective. So for all practical purposes, to meet a functional requirement, the limits described around it, the thresholds described around it, which essentially describe the quality of that product, are the non-functional requirements, which could include the reliability, security, performance, safety, level of service, supportability, retention, etc. Then the transition requirements describe temporary capabilities such as data conversion and training requirements needed to transition from the current as is state to the future to be state. If you have to transit the output of this project to the organization, what arrangements, necessary transition arrangements have to be made. Maybe you have to provide training to the people, maybe the machinery has to be shifted from one place to the other, and that arrangement has to be done. This all is called the transition requirement. Then are the project requirements, which describe the actions, processes, or other conditions the project needs to meet. Project requirements are specifically for the project. So from the project management point of view, what all you need to do? Maybe you have to establish a PMO, maybe you want to have a project management system in place, or you want to buy a software for project management. This all are the project requirements. Finally, the quality requirements capture any condition or criteria needed to validate the successful completion of the project deliverable or fulfillment of other project requirements. So quality requirements would establish a kind of a threshold, uh, quality acceptance criteria, you can say, but this will only verify whether the things are according to the desired quality or not. So this must be properly jotted down somewhere. Moving on to the collect requirements process. In collect requirements, what we need to do is, we need to, as we were discussing before, we need to get in touch with our stakeholders and collect all their needs and expectations in shape of the requirements and induct all those requirements which should and could be included. So we will have the scope management plan and the requirement management plan as an input, but at the same time we also need to have the stakeholder management plan, because stakeholder management plan is going to tell us how to manage the stakeholder, and then the stakeholder register is also required. Why? Because it tells us who are the stakeholders, and project charter is giving me what the project is. So you see, this is very understandable. We do have the scope management plan, the requirement management plan, the stakeholder management plan. We do have the stakeholder register from whom we have to collect the needs and requirement, and the charter, which is a dominating document telling us what to do. And what I need to do, I need to produce, look at outputs, I need to have the requirements document completed. And also, I need to have a requirement traceability metric. Every requirement must be traceable. Who has given this requirement? Who was the stakeholder? And what are the work packages or whatever linkages are available to fulfill this requirement, and ultimately what is the output it will produce. This is the complete chain. This is the complete trace of that requirement. So we will, whenever there is a change in requirements, we will amend this trace. Now look at the tools and techniques which we require to use for establishing these requirements. And there are a number of tools here, a huge list, but this is otherwise very natural. If you are gathering, collecting the data from a select group of people only, you say you have got about 6 people from whom you have to collect this data, you are very clear about it, you know that there are the senior executives and they know everything and they will tell me all the details, then interviewing is a very good mechanism where I can go to fix a time and go to each and every one of those 6 executives and talk to them. I have prepared questions, I discuss with them. This is a very good way of collecting the information because this is qualitative in nature. We discuss the things, although I may have some questions in my mind, but we will discuss it in that meeting. And during this meeting, depending upon the answer given to me, I would frame another question which could be completely new. So you don't know what will the ultimate direction the interview will take, but it will end up giving us a lot of information. So we'll keep jotting down those minutes and then we will use that information. This is the easiest way of doing it, and naturally this is the most qualitative mechanism. Sometimes, this is my practical experience that even although this is good to interview people at top level, if they are knowledgeable and they know everything, but sometimes you don't have the top executives knowing nothing about the organization even. They are just the managers, the senior managers. When you ask them some question, they will say, well, my subordinate will know that and my technical expert would know that. So in that case, you ask them to collect a focus group. All those people who know everything, bring them along in this interview and we will have a meeting with a focus group. And in this focus group, the advantage is that every question which the executive was otherwise postponing, the people who are able to answer that are present there and they will be able to answer it. But there is a little downside to that. That is, the people are subordinate to this boss, and naturally, in presence of him, they might not be saying something which they think the boss doesn't want to listen. Number one. Number two, the way you were interviewing the boss himself, and there was a kind of frankness in which you were having that interview one-to-one. Now, even if you ask a question to the boss, he would not be that informal with you. He would be in front of his subordinate. He would be very formal. He would not be smiling and things like that. Moreover, there is another negative thing in this focus group, and that is called group think. Group think is, if your boss says this is to be done this way, everybody starts thinking, yes, this will be done this way. So people may provide us the wrong answers because of this pressure. Then the third method is the facilitated workshops. This is when you think that you have to reach out to the lower levels in the organization and get a general opinion from the people, or the opinion is to be gathered from wide audience. So you may like to conduct a facilitated workshop in which you call a wide audience from the employees, and you in fact present to them what is the job given to you and how do you intend doing it, and then ask their opinion. So you will see there will be so many opinions coming from the such an audience, and you will be able to learn a lot from that. If it is possible to note down all those points during the workshop, this is good enough. Otherwise, you can even have a mechanism by which the people can write down things and put them into a jar, and later on you can compile all those responses. Now, two more techniques which are, when you're working in a group, how to deal with the people in a creative and decision-making environment. There are certain projects in which you have to be creative, but people are tied up with the group thing. A group is normally tied up in a group thing. As one person says something, all others will adopt that idea and they will not like to use their own brains. So we want people to think independently, out of the box, and therefore there are certain techniques and tools by which you can entice people to be more creative. You kind of untie them from the group thing and uh, test their innovation or creativity. I'm not going into the detail of those techniques, but yes, there are ways and available to do that. For example, this is kind of misdirecting someone from his normal path of thinking. If someone is strictly thinking on a specific direction, I will, disturb his direction and ask him something irrelevant, which will break his, line of thought, and he would start thinking in yet another direction, which I have given him, and that would invoke creativity. This is just a very simple example. I have many other examples, but time doesn't permit me to go into the detail of creativity. Then are the group decision-making techniques. You see, whenever a group gets together to decide something, it is the purpose always is that a better decision would come out. But unfortunately, groups never decide the best because they compromise. The best ideas are usually thrown out, and the most compromised ideas are the decisions of the group. So if I say that the IQ of a group decision, IQ of a group decision is lower than the highest IQ of the people sitting in the group, that would be very true. But we want to use synergy. We want to use certain techniques which would polish the decision making and which would promote the best decision to come out of it. So that such like techniques would be the group decision making techniques. Then if the audience is too much and we can't even reach out to them, then we generally resort to the questionnaires and surveys. You might have been receiving all these questionnaires and surveys all the time from PhD students or from other organizations who are doing certain kinds of surveys, and they're collecting data. So questionnaires and surveys is a very good mechanism, but this mechanism is not qualitative in nature. This is quantitative in nature. You just count how many people have said yes to this question and how many have said no, and then you form an opinion about it. Then the next method is observations. You do not ask anyone anything. You go to that organization, observe their environment, and you can have a view of your own about these people. So observation can also be a very enriching experience. Prototyping, some of the things could not be explained. We two people are discussing and I'm trying to explain something to you as I am, but sometimes I need to explain it on a piece of paper. So I may have to draw it on screen for you as if you can understand. So this is prototyping. Or even if drawing is not enough, maybe I have to, show you a three-dimensional model to, communicate my idea properly to you. That is called prototyping. So just to make the things more understandable for the other is prototyping. Benchmarking is yet another mechanism in which you compare yourself with your competitors and then conduct an analysis where we stand, where our competitors stand, who is at the top, where do we stand, and how much is the distance between us and the best competitor, and how can we bridge that. So this is the purpose of a benchmarking. So we do benchmarking also. Then context diagram is a kind of a flow diagram in which you establish the context of things and we draw things in a kind of a flow, and we say these things are going from here to here and things like that. And then are the document analysis. We look at the documents and we try to analyze that documents and come up with certain conclusions about the organization. So these are the various methods of collecting the requirements. So you can see here the inputs to the collect requirement process are the charter and the stakeholder register. You see, the identify stakeholder has given me the stakeholder register, which was, where was identify stakeholder done? It was in an initiation. And plan stakeholder management, so far we have not studied it. This is the last chapter, but that would produce the stakeholder management plan, and that is also required here. Then we, from scope management, plan scope management 5.1 process, we get the requirement management plan and the scope management plan. These are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 inputs. So collect requirements is producing what? This is producing the requirements documentation and the requirement traceability matrix. You see, the requirement traceability matrix is only required in the processes in monitoring and control. Scope processes and monitoring and control. You can follow this arrow of requirement traceability matrix. It is going to only to validate scope and control scope, nowhere else. The requirement documents are required by all of these processes. Even validate scope and control scope will require the requirement document. The define scope and create WBS also require it. And outside of scope, we need to give these requirement documents to quality management plan and to procurement management plan. So these were the inputs we have discussed. Then tools, I have elaborated each one of them. You can write, read through these if you want to understand them even more. And these were the different requirements, traceability matrix, and a format of traceability matrix is also given. And this is just a suggestion. This is just an example. PMI never advise a format. They believe that the formats have to be created by the organization themselves. So this could be a format in which you see the requirement description is here, and then it is tied up to what is the business need, opportunity or goal or objective for which this requirement was initiated. What was the project objective this requirement was supporting? What are the WBS deliverables this requirement has resulted in? What design, product design is impacted by this requirement description, product development, and so on and so forth. So you see, I can trace this requirement through all these areas, and each and every requirement can be checked whether it has gone through all this. It has every requirement may have its own test cases. Have those test cases been passed? And if that is so, then the requirement is fulfilled. Then is the define scope. This is the process where we develop the scope statement. Define scope is the process of detailed description. This is the place where the scope is defined to the optimum. Scope was never defined before in such a great detail, because here we are talking about the project as well as the product scope to be described in detail. Key benefit of this process is that it describes the project service or result boundaries by defining which of the requirements collected will be included in and excluded from the project scope. So what requirements we have collected, after making all the adjustments, adding those requirements which were approved and which were right, and those excluding those requirements which are not to be included in the project scope, we establish first the product scope and then the project scope. This is a written statement which provides, as we studied earlier, the project justification, the major deliverables, and the project objective. And also, because it will define the phases also, it establishes the criteria to determine if the project or phase has been successfully completed. So that means the phases have been defined in the scope statement. Since all the requirements identified in collect requirements may not be included in the project, this is the description of what we have already talked about. The define scope process selects the final project requirement from the requirement documentation delivered during the collect requirements process. It then develops a detailed description of the project and product service or result. The preparation of a detailed project scope statement is critical to project success and builds upon the major deliverables assumptions and constraints that are documented during the project initiation. So whatever high level assumptions, constraints and risks, etc. have been given to us in charter, we are going to accommodate them, but at the same time we can detail them as well, and we can even identify more of these assumptions, constraints, and limitations. During project planning, the project scope is defined and described with greater specificity as more information about the project is known. This is the progressive elaboration. So we will keep adding to it through proper change control. Existing risks, assumptions and constraints are analyzed for completeness and added or updated as necessary. The defined scope process can be highly iterative because changes are continuously going to be coming in it. In iterative life cycle projects, a high level vision will be developed for the overall project. But the detailed scope is determined one iteration at a time, and the detailed planning for the next iteration is carried out as work progresses on the current project scope and deliverable. You see, if your project is in phases and it's a highly iterative project, then you will establish the product and project scope for every phase. And you complete that and then you think about the next phase. So this is where the whole scope cannot be determined in the beginning, and we want to go phase by phase. So what all is included here? Scope management plan is required. Naturally, it is to be required. Project charter is required. Requirement documents are required, and organizational process assets are required. Tools and techniques which we use here are pretty much simple. We know what the expert judgment is. The new thing is the product analysis. Why are we doing the product analysis? Product analysis is to be done to determine the product scope. And how do we do the product analysis? We have all the requirements, and putting those requirements together, we try to bring it into a shape of a product. We imagine the product and we analyze how these dimensions fit into the product, and we compare it with the items available in market similar to this product. So this is my product analysis, and this product analysis will also help me in generating the next item is alternative generation. Alternatives will be identified and generated. How this product which we have just visualized can be produced. There could be many approaches to do that. So all the approaches or alternatives have to be identified and generated, and ultimately one of them could be selected, which we will further divide into phases. And for doing all this job, we may need to conduct another facilitated workshop. We can go back to the people, we can talk to them, we can show them our results, we can take more suggestions and get back to this exercise again. So facilitated workshop could be also one of the tools. The result is to develop a project scope statement, and naturally any project documents which needs to be updated will be updated. You remember in integration I told you that project management plan update and project document update, these two items may be seen very usually now after this process in outputs. So in output, for the first time in scope, you are seeing project document update. Meaning what? That while we were producing the project scope statement here, the inputs which were used to develop this project scope statement might be impacted and changed, and that is we are changing something in the project documents. We are updating something in the project document. Maybe the requirement document has been amended in light of the scope statement, and we update that because that is part of the project document. So that requirement document is being updated. So that is called project document is being updated. Okay, so this process scope, defines scope. We have the scope management plan, we have the requirement document, we have the organizational process, we have the project charter from 4 different places. These inputs are coming, 2 from within the scope and 2 from outside. Then what it is producing? It is producing the project document update. Update always goes to the project document archive and the project scope statement. It is distributed to 4 processes. Number 1, it goes to the create WBS process, which is a scope process, scope planning process, and the scope statement also will be required for sequencing the activities, duration estimation, and developing the schedule. All these three processes are from time management. So scope statement is very importantly required for the time management process. So whenever you are sequencing the activities or estimating their duration or developing the schedule, we have to consider the scope statement all the time. Scope statement is not required anywhere else except for these things. So these are the different inputs to this defined scope, tools and techniques. You can read through them. I have explained them in front of you. Just look at this chart table 5.1. This just shows what all could be included in a project charter and what all could be included in a scope statement. Apparently, I do not really agree with this because this essentially shows that project charter is probably a larger document with more things in it, and project scope statement is a very small document. No, sir, this is not the case. Project charter is a smaller document. No matter these headings included here are too many, but actually all these headings are to be addressed in detail in scope statement. So scope statement is going to be the larger document, but all these topics and items will be addressed there. Although here it says high level requirement, there those requirements are detailed level, and therefore they will take more space. But a high level requirement would be only few, maybe you can write them in one sentence. So all this long list of project charter items could probably be fitting into a 1 page or a 1.5 page. Whereas the scope statement would define the project scope description in detail, all the acceptance criteria, all the project deliverables. I mean, it's not just the end deliverable, but the whole deliverable phases, deliverables of each phases, what is not to be included in the project, what are the, in detail, all these things are to be given in the scope statement. Therefore, the scope statement document is more detailed and more lengthy. Ultimately, the project documents, naturally the project document, I said it can amend certain things which were being input. Stakeholder register could be amended in light of it. Requirement documents could be amended in light of it. Requirement traceability metrics could be amended due to it. So once we are establishing the scope statement, we can send waves to these documents and we can update them. In planning, the last process is the work breakdown structure. And this is the process of subdividing the project deliverable and the project work into smaller and more manageable components. Key benefit is provides a structured vision of what has been delivered. So we are breaking the things down to the work package level. What are the processes here? Scope management plan is required, scope statement is required, requirement documentation is required, and enterprise environmental factor and process assets. The main tool here for creating the WBS is decomposition. You must have the skill of breaking the things open. You know this is the phase, what should be included in the phase. If your mind doesn't work, that means you do not have the decomposition skills. You must be able to easily describe what should be included in this. This is called decomposition. And naturally you will use the expert judgment and you will come up with the WBS structure and WBS what do you call that definition. So all this along with the scope statement forms part of the scope baseline. So the output shown here is scope baseline, but if you read the details of the scope baseline, you will know that this includes three things. Number one, scope statement. Number two, WBS. Number three, WBS dictionary. And any project documents could be updated due to it. Right, this is how these things are coming from. Enterprise environmental factor and process is coming from the organization. Collect requirements is giving us the requirement document. Plan scope management is giving us the scope management plan, and define scope has given us the scope statement. Now all of these things put together, we will start decomposing our project into work packages, And as a result, the scope baseline, which I already told you includes the scope statement, WBS and the WBS dictionary, is distributed to these many places. Because all the knowledge areas will start from here. They will start working from here onwards. So for validation of scope, we'll always look back at the scope baseline. For development of the project management plan, this scope baseline will update into the project management, will form part of the project management plan. When we are defining the activities, we need this baseline because we are further going to decompose them. When we are estimating the cost, we need to have the scope baseline in front of us. Determining the budget, again, scope baseline is required. When we are identifying the risks, that is again, we have to keep ourselves within the boundaries of the scope. And when we are doing the qualitative risk analysis, that is a kind of analysis which is done after the risks have been identified. Again, we have to keep ourselves within the boundaries of the scope. So these were all the places from where this scope baseline is going, and project documents are updated into the archive. Okay, create WB as a concept. Define the project scope of work in terms of deliverables, and to further decompose this deliverable into components or work. This is the easiest way of doing it. That say you have got 5 phases and you know what are the deliverables of each phase. You try to subdivide this deliverable into sub-deliverables, and you keep breaking it open till you feel that this is the level, comfortable level for me to monitor as a project manager. To provide a project management plan team a framework on which to base project status and project progress reports, and this is also to facilitate the communication. After this breakdown, you will be able to what information is to be created and communicated, and what process is to be done where, when, and how. Naturally, it is all dependent on WBS. All the further opening up of the project of various knowledge areas will happen due to this as a key input to other project management processes and deliverables. So some of the terms you must understand. When you are breaking, this is a hierarchical kind of a structure. When you are breaking the project into phases and phases into something else, and that into work packages, so what you are doing, you are going a level down every time. So what if we can code this system of hierarchy? If we say the top level hierarchy is number 1, the next level is 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. The next level is 1.1.1, 1.1.2, and so on. And this is how, or some other coding mechanism you establish. This is going to be very useful for the accounting purposes. Normally, accounting people do not need to use the actual names of the processes or the work packages. They are happy with the code. So they would say 1.2.3 has been allocated a budget of this much. So they will just remember that activity or that work package by its code, and that would be a unique identifier for each element of the WBS, which would be useful for accounts also. Work packages is a deliverable at the lowest level of WBS. WBS is considered to be broken down to a level which is work package, and this work package should not be further broken down. So it is considered that this is the lowest level, but actually this is not the lowest level, because these work packages are packages of work. They contain more than one activities, and when we are identifying the activities, we will have to break down those work packages further. But as far as the WBS is concerned, WBS does not go down to the activity level. The least level for WBS is the work package level. Task is a term for work whose means and placement within the structured plan for project work varies by the application area, etc. Task and activities are interchangeably used. Work package I have defined. Now, we talked about the code of account. There was a numbering system. The level at which the accounting is being controlled. This is, we have got 5-tier level of the work WBS. and the lowest level is work packages. But the control account people may not be interested in monitoring each and every work package, although project manager was interested in each and every work package. But the accounts people are interested maybe a level above the work package. Like you see, construction of a wall was a work package and project manager was interested in noting the progress of that. He wants to have a progress on that. But the control people cannot go for every work package. So what they do is they give the one complete room, they consider the one complete room which includes the walls, roofs and everything. All those work packages are included in that as one control account. And the person who is supervising the construction of that room, that person is declared a control accountant. He is given the budget for that room and he is the person who will be answerable for the whole control account. For this whole room, he will be answerable to the accounts people. So he is a mini control accountant who has a control account to himself. But a control account may have many work packages and many activities. Each level, and every element in each level of hierarchy is called a WBS element. Now we have got another thing which I must describe. This is the discrete effort, apportioned effort and level of effort. Normally our activities should be discrete. Discrete are those activities which 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 have got discrete effort clearly defined. You mean if I am constructing a wall, I would know by the activity itself that this is a 10-foot long wall and which is 10-foot high wall and 30-foot long wall, and this is to be constructed with these kinds of bricks and this is the size of the brick, and therefore I will use these many bricks and I will have to have these many people. So where you can discretely allocate the resources to an activity, this is called a discrete effort. But there are certain activities which cannot be measured. For example, you are constructing the wall. This is one activity, construction of the wall, and I am your supervisor and my job is to supervise the wall. Now wall can be measured, supervision cannot be measured. My work is dependent on your work. If you perform 50%, my supervision is counted as 50%. So my job cannot be measured. My job, progress of my job is dependent on your job. It is called apportioned effort. Then is level of effort. Level of effort is also kind of a portioned effort, but level of effort is not dependent on one single activity. This is dependent on a larger portion of activities, maybe 5 activities, maybe a whole phase or even the whole project. So you might be doing an activity throughout a project life cycle or throughout a phase life cycle. That activity again cannot be measured by itself. It depends upon the completion of that phase or that project. Howsoever is the progress of the project or phase, that is your the progress of your level of effort. For example, you are running this project of building a house, and throughout this process, this project, you are doing one activity, and that is the activity of project management. The activity of project management is consistent and throughout the life of the project. Somebody asked you how much project management have you done? What do you respond? It is equal to the progress of the project. Naturally, this is just like a portion effort, but here we are talking about the whole length of the project or whole length of the phase. So just to give you these ideas, because these ideas will be used when you are trying to estimate the cost or time and things like that. Right. You can just go through these inputs and outputs, and there is nothing very complex about it. These are some demonstrations how a WBS may look like. If you can see this diagram, you will be able to see that it is an aircraft system. This is the aircraft system, and there's the top level, and then they're further broken down to smaller parts. So this is how the WBS opens up. Look at another example. This is a software development. You see, the project management has shown as a separate stream of work. Product requirement as a separate stream of work, and so on and so forth. This is not necessary that then every project has to be divided into phases. Phases are necessary, but you know, the WBS is not necessarily the second level must be phases. It is not necessary. It could be the deliverable, main parts of the deliverable, or it could be the division of the work, or something like that. In this diagram, this is a sample WBS decomposed down to through the work packages, in which you are shown the numbers, the code of account. If the value management system project is 1.0, the need assessment is 1.1, standard development is 1.2, system engineering is 1.3. Then under need assessment, we have got 1.1.1, 1.1.2, and so on and so forth. So this is the code of account. This is the example of code of account. Another example, then we have decomposition. Now, if you understand what a WBS is, and you already know what our organizational structure is, then we can relate the WBS with the organizational structure, because the WBS, the lowest elements are the work, and in organization, the lowest element are people. People do work. Therefore, if I can put them in a shape of a matrix, where on the row, on the columns we have the work, and on the rows we have the people, then we can say this person is assigned to this and this job, this person is assigned to this and this job. This is called responsibility assignment matrix. This is not necessarily to be shown in this kind of a diagram. This could be shown in form of a Excel sheet or a table. So you can write the names of the people on one side and the work on the other side, and then at their junction you can show, or you can tick, that these are the people involved in this work. So this is a responsibility. This is called the responsibility assignment matrix, which will be further discussed in human resource management knowledge area. This can also be used, this responsibility assignment matrix kind of thing can be used for assigning the control account responsibilities. So if you can change the level, you can take it back to the control account level, and you can assign it to various people. Then this would be called a control account matrix. This is another way of showing the WBS. You see, it is not necessary that all the decomposition of all the branches should be at the same level. Some of the branches can be opened more and some cannot. So whichever are the lowest level works on each are the work packages. So like in 1.3, we have got 1.3.1 and 1.3.2 as the work packages, whereas in 1.6.4, we have got 3 other items. These are the work packages. So work packages could be defined as the lowest level. If something cannot be broken any further, then that is the lowest level. Moreover, you cannot relate two items from two different streams or two different hierarchies. 1.1.4 cannot be connected to 1.3.2 because they have no relationship as such. This is not allowed. WBS can be shown like in MS Project or other places. It is shown as a tree. So this is a tree kind of a format. Then you expert judgment and use the expert judgment. Output is the scope baseline, which includes the scope statement, WBS and WBS dictionary, and outputs can be the project document update. Next is validate scope. Validate scope and control scope are very easy, because in validate scope you just have to finally accept the deliverable. This is the formalizing acceptance of the completed deliverable. Key benefit is brings objectivity to the acceptance process. So this is the process of formalizing the acceptance, reviewing the deliverable, obtaining formal acceptance, primarily concerned with the acceptance of the deliverable, not the correctness or meeting quality requirement. Quality control has already checked this deliverable. Quality control is a different subject. We are not looking at how correct that thing is or how good in quality that item is. We are just saying, is it there and is it having all the requirements fulfilled or not? If so, then this is user acceptance is done. Generally performed after the quality control, but can be confirmed in parallel in certain cases. Acceptance criteria is a set of conditions that is required to be met before the deliverables are accepted. So these conditions state how the project team is going to demonstrate to the customer that they have in fact met the requirement. So this is the user requirements which actually clearly define that when you have created the document, how the customer should be presented that document, how it will be checked and all that. Those requirements are the user requirements, are the acceptance criteria. If you can't say how you are going to provide this demonstration, then you probably don't sufficiently understand the requirement. Acceptance criteria should be defined in conjunction with requirement and should be the basis of the testing strategy and test plan. Then verified deliverable is something which is coming out of the quality control. Anything passes the quality control is a verified deliverable. Something getting into the validated scope is this this verified deliverable. Verified deliverable is input into the validated scope, which is once passed is called accepted deliverable. Now look at this. You will see exactly what I am saying. Project plan is input, requirement document and traceability matrix is input. Verified deliverable is input here. That is the main thing. And naturally the work performance data is also received. Inspection is carried out. That is the major job of it. Inspection is carried out for user acceptance. Group decision making technique amongst the team deciding would be used, and as a result, if the thing is okay, then accepted deliverable come out of it, and if it is not correct, then change request will be moved out of it. Work performance data after this analysis would be converted into work performance information, and project documents will be updated. So these are the inputs and outputs. Last is the scope control. Scope control, here we check the process, the project scope. Process of monitoring the status of the project and product scope and managing changes to scope baseline, that is through the change request. Key benefit of this process is to allow the scope baseline to be maintained throughout the project scope. What is this? Process of monitoring the status of project and product scope and managing changes to the project scope baseline, as we said, ensures all requested changes and recommended corrective and preventive actions are processed through the perform integrated change control. This will ensure that all the change requests will go to perform integrated change control, as we already know. Manage the actual changes when they occur and is integrated with the other control processes. And the most important thing is uncontrollable changes. Uncontrollable changes are often called scope creep. Scope creep is a change which has come with a scope change which has happened without any change request due to unknown reasons. This is a scope creep, and this is very dangerous because as soon as you catch the scope creep, you must correct it. You must move a change request to amend it. If not, then it is going to cause a lot of damage to you. Change is inevitable, therefore mandating some type of change control process is necessary. Controlling the project scope ensures all requested changes and recommended corrective preventive actions are processed through the integrated change control, as I just said. In this process, we have the project management plan as an input, requirement management document and traceability matrix. Anyways, these two things, as I said before, these will be input here. Work performance data is necessary major input here because this will create the work performance information after the variance analysis, which is the tool and technique. And naturally, any lessons learned are organizational process assets. These are input. Organizational process assets are input. As if we know how to control the scope, we take lesson from organization process assets. But as an output also, organization process assets are being updated because whatever lessons we learned through this process may be recorded in organizational process assets for future use. So Work performance data has been converted into work performance information. If there is any change, is moved as a change request. Project management plan, if change, will be project management plan update. Project documents, if change, will become project document update. Organizational process assets, if change, would become organization process assets updates. So we are creating all kinds of updates here in the control process. And these are again the inputs and outputs. So this brings us to the end of this chapter. I hope I have fast tracked to the time limit. Did you get anything?
Yes, sir. It's all good for now.
Was it too fast today?
No, sir. I guess things are fine because mostly we are repeating things, and plus they are not that difficult as well. So I mean, we just need to repeat them to memorize. I mean, that's it.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I just gave you the salient, the important items which you must remember and must understand. So if you will just, listen to this thing again, those will be reminded, and probably it is not going to be much difficult for you to pass the exam. So if there are no other questions, we must call it a night, not the day. So thank you very much for your company, and we will meet on Monday now.
Sure, sir. Thank you very much. Good night and have a great weekend.
Take care. Bye.